At noon, the sky goes dark. This wasn't weather. It was a signal. We're exploring the death of Jesus in Mark 15:33 to 41. Let's read verse 33 from the ESV. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. What do we know so far? Jesus was crucified in the 3rd hour, about 9 a.m., and the people passing by on the road, some priests and scribes, and even the 2 thieves crucified at his right and left, mocked and ridiculed Jesus. Now Mark tells us that something extraordinary happened at the 6th hour, or noon. He said that when it reached noon, there was darkness over the whole land. So what? Why does that matter? Under normal circumstances, noon marks the brightest period of the day. But on the day of Jesus' crucifixion, it became dark at noon. And not just that, the way Mark wrote this is telling. A more literal translation would be, "And when it became the 6th hour, a darkness happened upon the whole land until the 9th hour." Mark constructed his sentence to communicate a concurrence of events. It became noon, and a darkness happened. It's not a simple coincidence, nor is it normal for the land to become dark for 3 hours at the peak of daylight. The 3 hours of darkness are unnatural, or perhaps a better word is supernatural. The Old Testament prophet Amos wrote this in chapter 8, verse 9. "And on that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon, and darken the earth in broad daylight." On what day? If you read Amos chapter 8 in its entirety, it is pretty obviously describing a day of judgment and punishment of the sins of his people. So, in the context of the crucifixion of Jesus, the darkness signals that Jesus is drinking the cup of God's wrath and experiencing God's judgment on behalf of those who sinned against God. From the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, the consequence of sin is separation from God. Adam and Eve lost direct access to God after the fall. And the concept that the wages of sin is death is an expression of that principle. Because sin separates us from the God who breathed life into humanity, sin results in the ultimate separation: death. Bear that in mind as we proceed to verse 34. "And at the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" At the end of the 3 hours of darkness, at about 3 p.m., Jesus cried out loudly. What did he cry? He quoted Psalm 22, verse 1, verbatim, in Aramaic. And Mark, as usual, provided a translation of the Aramaic for those of his readers who were not familiar with that language. Psalm 22 describes the suffering of a servant of God, and when Jesus quotes the psalm, he identifies himself with that sufferer. Consider the meaning of the loud cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, feels forsaken or abandoned by God, his Father. Why? Because as the substitute for sinners, he is experiencing the full separation from God that is a part of drinking the cup of God's wrath. Sin separates the sinner from God, and as Jesus takes on the sin of the world, he is utterly separated from God, his Father. That is the genuine anguish, not the nails, not the crown of thorns, not the abandonment by his disciples, not the taunting and jeering of the crowd. The separation from God to pay the price for sins he did not commit is the true burden he is bearing. Let's read verse 35. "And some of the bystanders hearing it said, Behold, he is calling Elijah." Some who were standing around the site of the crucifixion when Jesus cried out thought he was calling the prophet Elijah. This would be a simple mistake to make for a person who was not a Hebrew or Aramaic speaker, but who had heard of Elijah. Eloi and Eliyahu were phonetically similar enough to cause this confusion. Earlier in Mark's Gospel, we learned that Elijah was supposed to precede the arrival of the Messiah, and we saw that John the Baptist had fulfilled that Elijah-like role as the front-runner for Jesus. At the Transfiguration, the actual Elijah appeared, with Moses alongside the glorified Jesus. Elijah, as a figure, has been important throughout Mark's Gospel, and was culturally important enough that some in the crowd think Jesus is calling out for Elijah. Look at verse 36. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Hearing the great cry, someone went forward with a wine-soaked sponge on a reed to offer Jesus a drink in his suffering. Was this an act of pity or further mockery? Mark doesn't say, but either way, the other bystanders intervened. "Wait! Don't dull his senses with wine. If he's calling for Elijah to rescue him, we should wait and see what happens." But, thanks to Mark's translation of the Aramaic, we know that Jesus was not calling for Elijah, but calling to God his Father. Mark's Gospel is filled with examples of Jesus being misunderstood, and this is certainly another. Now, the moment. Look at verse 37. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. Mark's Greek text literally says, "And Jesus, after releasing a great sound, expired," or breathed out. He emitted a noise, not a word, but a sound of despair, and then he expired. The wind, the breath, went out from him, and he died. When God created humanity, he formed a body of the stuff of the earth, and breathed into it the breath of life, or the spirit which makes alive, and it became a living being. And when Jesus breathed out, when the spirit went out of him, separated from God his Father, he died. He ceased to be a living being. Notice that the death of Jesus was not a quiet fading away. It was a punctuated death at the end of the 3 hours of darkness. At the culmination of the judgment period, after proclaiming a sense of forsakenness and separation from God, he suddenly died. Jesus had only been on the cross for 6 hours. It was common to suffer for days on a cross before dying. His death is not a submission to the natural physiological effects of crucifixion. It was too soon for that, but a consequence of being forsaken and separated from God, the life-giver, as he bore the sins of humanity in our place. His death was a moment chosen, an act of will, a sacrifice to make atonement for sins, and to make reconciliation with God possible for sinful humanity. Despite being surrounded by people, Jesus died alone. Look at verse 38. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. What curtain? Inside the temple complex was a sanctuary called the Most Holy Place, or the Holy of Holies. It symbolized God's dwelling place and contained the Ark of the Covenant, God's throne on earth. A curtain separated this inner sanctum from the outer sanctuary, where the altar of sacrifice was, except for on the Day of Atonement, once a year, when the high priest entered the most holy place to sprinkle the blood of atonement and cleanse the collective sins of the people. Anyone entering that place was struck dead. The curtain was the barrier between sinful humanity and a holy God. At the moment that Jesus died, the curtain of separation was torn from top to bottom. It was a large curtain, the top of which could only be reached with scaffolding or ladders. So when Mark tells his readers that the curtain was torn from top to bottom, we must assume that the tearing was done by God and not by men. The death of Jesus signaled the end of the separation of God and man. The real sacrifice for sin has been made, the Son of God, and not goats and lambs. The price has been paid. Genuine atonement and reconciliation are available, and the created can be reunited with the Creator. This is not the first time in Mark's Gospel that something has been torn in two from the top. At Jesus' baptism, Mark told us that as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn in two, and the Spirit coming down upon him. The same verb is used by Mark to describe both things being torn, the heavens and the curtain. In both instances, the barrier that separates God and man is sundered, and in both cases, the path is opened from God's side, not man's. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry and at its culmination, the message is clear. The Christ has come as God's instrument to open the way for man to approach God and to be reconciled. God is tearing the boundary open. On to verse 39. And when the centurion, who stood facing him, saw that in this way he breathed his last, He said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." There's so much packed into this verse. First, Mark is writing about the centurion, and not a centurion. The man in question is in command of the detachment responsible for the executions of these three men. He is the supervisor of the procedure. He's there to certify that the death sentences were carried out, and to ensure no one interferes. He will also report back to the governor's office that the condemned men have died. He's a senior military man in a position of authority and responsibility, and he has surely seen many crucifixions. Mark tells us that he stood facing Jesus, so he knows what happened that day. He saw it personally and observed it professionally. And then Mark tells his readers that the centurion made a profound utterance for a specific reason. The centurion saw the way Jesus breathed his last. In other words, when the crucifixion expert saw the circumstances of Jesus' death, the short time on the cross, the 3 hours of darkness, the loud cries, and the sudden expiration, he was struck by what he witnessed and made a declaration. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Many times in Mark's Gospel, Jesus said, "Truly, I say to you." But the centurion didn't use the same word for truly. He used a word that is more accurately translated as genuinely, meaning in real essential nature. So what? Why does it matter? The centurion, seeing the manner of Jesus' death, concluded that Jesus was, in very nature, the genuine Son of God. The first witness to declare the crucified Christ as God's Son was not a disciple. He was not a priest or other religious leader. He was a Gentile, a pagan, a Roman soldier. The veil of misunderstanding about Jesus was pierced by the circumstances of his death. The cross revealed his genuine identity to the centurion. Let's move on to verses 40 and 41. There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joses, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. The witnesses to Jesus' death were not the powerful, not the apostles, but women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, who had served him during his ministry, presumably tending to basic needs like cooking and laundry. Mark names several of them, despite not mentioning them earlier in his Gospel. Why do you think that is? By the time he wrote his Gospel, these women would have been recognizable figures in the story of Jesus. They not only witnessed Jesus' death on the cross, but we will see that they witnessed his burial and were the first to see the empty tomb after his resurrection. They are important because they saw these three events, while his hand-chosen 12 have been scattered. Mark's Gospel is full of examples of Jesus being misunderstood, especially by those who should know better, like his disciples and the priests and scribes. But Jesus' genuine identity is understood by the centurion charged with carrying out his execution. And the witnesses who can verify his death, burial, and resurrection aren't prominent or powerful men, but women who saw to his practical needs during his ministry. When the chosen ones scattered, the women stood by and became witnesses to the most important events of all time. Next time, the burial of Jesus. Thank you for studying with me. Please share this video today.